Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The importance of this issue to everyone here could not be clearer. I'm Ross Easton, as I said, Director of External Affairs at Energy Networks Association. We're the industry body representing the energy networks. For those that don't know us, our members operate the electricity wires, gas pipes and energy system in the UK and in Ireland as well. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first of our Next for Net Zero events. As you may have read already, we've set this series up to delve into the emerging challenges to delivering net zero and the solutions that are being developed to resolve them as well. I'm excited to hear from our panel today, who bring national and international expertise to one of the most prescient topics facing our industry, and that's the need to create an offshore supergrid, particularly in the North Sea. It's a region which has been a hotbed of energy development for decades and will certainly be in the years to come. We've seen exponential growth in renewable energy, with wind both onshore and offshore, along with solar power plummeting in price and going from nascent technologies to the norm in an incredibly short space of time. That's a shift that will deliver lower prices for customers and less dependency on international energy prices and markets. Indeed, whilst the storms last week unfortunately caused some disruption for our members and the communities that they serve, it certainly set new records for wind power, which, according to National Grid ESO, the system operator, was providing over half of generation at one point, which is remarkable. These developments are undoubtedly good news for the environment, economy and customers alike. But now the government's attention and our own, as the industry's delivering net zero, is refocused towards new challenges, such as decarbonising heating and transport as affordably as possible, deepening the digitalisation of the energy system, and, as we're discussing today, connecting the explosive growth we're continuing to see in renewable energy sources. These are challenges which we, as energy networks, are uniquely placed to resolve. As we all know, until very recently, the UK was the world leader in offshore wind, and it's only recently been surpassed by China, which in classic fashion last year alone installed almost the same amount as has ever been installed before worldwide, which is remarkable. China's global share is now almost half of the 54 gigawatts of offshore wind power capacity globally. While we're not expanding at quite the same remarkable rate, the pace is certainly not out of the race. The UK offshore wind capacity is set to almost quadruple by 2030. The system we've got in place to support that growth, however, is not adequate, and we've not got much time to get that system sorted. The recent ScotWind auction awarded 60% of their capacity to floating wind, opening the door to a new era of deep water projects. We also have a CFD auction underway and the Crown Estate's fourth leasing round on the horizon. So with so many offshore wind projects that are due for connection over the next few years, for completion by 2032 to 2033, as well as the huge pipeline of electricity interconnectors and the government's ambitions for hydrogen production all to be realised, the existing rules and regulations are going to need a bit of a refresh and an update. Those that are already in place not only disincentivise joined up thinking, but in many instances act as a bit of a barrier to it, a fact that's been acknowledged by Ofgem and also by BEIS in their recent offshore transmission review. Reform to those rules and regulations needs to happen sooner rather than later, otherwise they're going to end up baking in problems for projects which will be coming thick and fast throughout this decade and next. The current regulatory regime favours uncoordinated infrastructure delivery with an immediate radial connection for each wind farm, with each having its own dedicated connection, rather than the sort of supergrid that we're going to be talking about today, and I'm confident many of us here think is essential for the longer term future of offshore wind, not only here in the UK, but internationally too. Now, there are a number of key considerations to increasing the coordination of network infrastructure for offshore wind. The way in which we best map the growth of offshore wind farms and interconnectors across the transmission network along the immediate coastline, the network reinforcements required further inland to accommodate increased demand on the network, and to ensure effective transport of power to where it is needed. This is often being forgotten. And the crowded nature of the North Sea, where existing offshore wind transmission cables, interconnectors and gas infrastructure can be better used in a joined up collective fashion. Fundamentally, the regulatory regime needs to ensure the right investment is available to achieve the Scottish and UK government's legally binding net zero targets. That's 2045 in Scotland and 2050 in the rest of the UK, as we all know. This means developing the solutions for bringing the energy generated offshore to where it is required in ways that are sensitive to the coastal and inland areas that house any resultant infrastructure. And when designing a new framework, it's critical to strike the right balance between the need to connect the growing volume of offshore wind, the immediate cost to UK consumers, and the meaningful and lasting impacts which could be delivered to both local communities and the environment. Community engagement is therefore crucial to delivering more offshore wind capacity, as building more offshore infrastructure can be disruptive, especially on the east coast of England, where so much of the offshore wind fleet and almost all of our interconnectors will come ashore. Now, bringing those communities along the journey can take many shapes and forms, including support for local communities through funds for installing technologies of the future, like electric vehicle chargers. But central to these customer conversations must be the work we've all done to minimise disruption and cost. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to our panel, chaired by Dr. Barbara Vest. Barbara.
There we go. Good morning. Lovely to welcome our panel today on this, about our first meeting. I'm just going to take a moment to introduce myself and my fellow panelists. So I'm Barbara Vest. I have over 30 years experience within the energy market, looking at market design, regulation, and I've gained experience whilst working in the supply businesses and latterly with Energy UK as their Director of Generation. I'd like to introduce Offshore first, who is our Commercial Regulation and Customer Director at National Grid. Offshore is responsible for all commercial and regulatory activities relating to interconnectors and the future Viking Link. That sounds exciting, Offshore. After you speak, we will be going on to Alan Carmel, who is Managing Director of Energy Transition of FTI Consulting. And Alan leads on a wide range of work relating to offshore wind and investigates the integration of renewable technologies into the electricity network. So that's going to be useful for this discussion. And finally, we're joined by Ian Duffy, who is Head of Communications and Advocacy for the UK offshore wind at BP. And Ian is responsible for stakeholder engagement, including communities, government, politics, and special interest groups. So I think we're going to have a really good discussion there amongst ourselves and with our audience. So Ashia, could I ask you to kick off the discussion, please?
Yes, I will do, Barbara, and thank you for the introduction. It's lovely to be here today, and it's lovely to be with the wonderful Barbara as well. I think, I guess, when we look after interconnectors within National Grid Ventures, and I think one of the things that allows us to do is to think about, how the UK is going to meet its net zero targets, but also not just how do we coordinate within the country, but how do we coordinate across countries as well. The EU also has a target called Fit for 55, which sounds a little bit like a fitness program to me. But I think it's fair to say that no country can go at this alone. And I think if we go back to what Ross just articulated, and the amount of infrastructure that's needed to get to net zero is huge. It's absolutely significant. And, it's not just onshore, but offshore as well. And to make this really cost efficient, we need to optimize the use of that renewable generation. And we, as National Grid Ventures, we want to coordinate that. We want to coordinate investing in networks which merge the networks with the wind and the renewable. But we're not the only ones having these conversations. There's similar types of discussions happening around all the North Sea countries, around all these coastal communities. And interestingly, part of our challenge has also been Brexit. So as National Grid, we've invested in actual infrastructure that links us up to countries around the North Sea. And we have Brexited, but our interconnectors are still running. But we strongly believe that the cooperation with the EU and the implementation of the trade agreement is important. So not just coordination within the country, but across countries as well to deliver those cost-efficient solutions. There's lots of influential stakeholders that are doing lots to bring this about. So Ofgem have just opened up a cap and floor window to take on new innovative types of infrastructure like multipurpose interconnectors, which are those hybrid infrastructure that could bring in the wind and the wires together. So that's a great first step towards coordination. There's bays in the UK. We've got member states like Belgium, Norway, and the Netherlands who are really pushing forward that coordination agenda. But in order to make it happen, I think there's a lot of high-level talk at the moment, but we need that next level of detail. So we've got a great track record. We're ready to engage. We're ready to coordinate and potentially build, but we need that high-level design to come together. We need what the ESO has called the holistic network design. And we need to know not what the design of the network is today, but what the design of the network will be tomorrow. So there's a trilemma of things that need to come together in order to bring about that coordination. We need markets, we need networks, and we need charging. And I think, you know, we keep talking about market reform, but we can't really do market reform properly if we don't know what the network looks like for tomorrow. Because if we do market reform on today's network, we'll probably get it very wrong. And so I think for me that's important. It's the timing of things. It's getting to that next level of detail and actually doing the right things at the right time to have an investable proposal for everybody, whether it's the wind generators, the wires, whoever needs to get together in order to build, to get us to net zero. And I think lastly, I just want to touch on sort of community engagement. I think, you know, the entire industry recognizes the impact of the huge infrastructure that needs to come inland to deliver net zero on our coastal communities. And I think that impact should not be underestimated. And that's where that coordination comes in. And that's going to be really important. There's lots we can do around coordinating infrastructure, around things like traffic management, which I know is a big thing. But also, I think just to use our own experience, so we went live with NSL, the North Sea Link, on the 1st of October 2021. And NSL is in Blythe. And we've got apprenticeship programs there at the moment, and more parties coming in terms of thinking about what to build there from an energy sector perspective. And I think it's a great example of, you know, we can actually make a very positive contribution to the local communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great start to share. And you covered so many things. I'm just wondering who has the crystal ball on all of this. But Alon, we'll come over to you next before we take some wider questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barbara. It's not me that has the crystal ball, unfortunately, but thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And thanks for the introduction, Barbara. As you said, I'm a managing director at FTI Consulting. So I'm a consultant who advises the energy companies, all the big energy companies, on strategy, essentially, in the energy transition. So FTI Consulting is a large American commercial and financial consultancy organization. My background actually is not too dissimilar from Barbara's. I spent about 5 years advising government on renewable energy subsidy design. So it was me and my team that designed the current renewable energy subsidy regime in the UK called the Contracts for Difference. And after that, I entered the private sector and worked as a consultant for the best part of 10 years, the last 10 years. As I said, I do mostly strategy consulting, new product, new market entry, auctions, investments, commercial due diligence, etc. Investments and transactions. And I mostly focus on offshore wind, although I do work in a number of other sectors as well, as you do as a consultant. But I'm passionate about the sector and the possibilities that we have. I mean, net zero, as Ross said, is an absolute imperative for our country and for the world, and we need to get there as quickly as possible. But that does and will involve an enormous transformation, enormous kind of. It's a big change that we all have to go through. The entire energy system is going to change. And the Committee on Climate Change in their 6th carbon budget try to come up with scenarios for how we get there. And actually the National Grid do these fantastic energy scenarios as well. But the Committee on Climate Change one is the one that I've got at the tip of my fingers, because the numbers are important, and they kind of give you a really important sense of the scale. So the Committee on Climate Change said that, to get to net zero by 2050, we might need something like 65 gigawatts to up to 125 gigawatts of offshore wind. We're at 10 gigawatts today. So that means, we need to build perhaps up to another 115 gigawatts, or, somewhere between 2 to 4 gigawatts a year need to be connected in order for us to be consistent with at least their view of what a reasonable, balanced pathway to 2050 looks like. And we've been nowhere near that so far. I mean, I think in the last 10 years, it's been somewhere like half a gigawatt on average, or maybe up to a gigawatt in the last few years that we've been accelerating. And that is an enormous challenge. There's a lot of connections, but on the plus side, the prize really, as well as this being essential to saving the world, there's an enormous economic opportunity here. I mean, the economic studies that I've seen suggest that there's something like 26,000 jobs in offshore wind in the UK at the moment. That could rise by 40,000 in the next 5 years. There could be an additional 40,000 jobs in the next 5 years. And going along with that, there's 60 billion pounds of investment in these large energy generating assets. So the prize is enormous, but the challenge is also enormous. Because as I said, there's the everything from the supply chain to the grid connections themselves, to raising the finance, but also doing all the environmental studies, and ensuring that the impact on the environment and on local communities is minimized and managed in a way so that they are allies and see the value and the benefits for them, not that this is something that's coming in from the outside and being just imposed on them. Mm-hmm. So that's I think the shape of the challenge, and because we have to accelerate in such a big way the amount of offshore wind that we install, that's why I think it's really critically important that we try to investigate and test and develop these new ways of connecting offshore wind farms, because the radial model has worked pretty well. I mean, the UK has been, I work in the US and Germany, Taiwan, Korea, a lot of countries that are desperately trying to build up their offshore wind industries. And one of the things a lot of them struggle with is the grid connection. And the UK, through its regulatory regime and through National Grid, have actually come up with a pretty innovative and very, very powerful model. The whole Offshore model of making grid connections work has meant that compared to our peers like Germany and the US, our industry has suffered far fewer delays and complications and cost overruns in terms of the transmission connections. And I think that's something to be, lauded, and the industry should be lauded and congratulated for. But nonetheless, the fundamental point still applies. I think that we need to come up with new models, because just connecting a bunch of new radial grid points into the system seems, I mean, maybe it's possible, but it seems like a huge challenge, and with all kinds of unintended consequences. So some form of greater coordination, whether that's through these hybrid interconnectors, or energy islands, or ring mains, or supergrids, I think is essential. And my current favorite is this idea of an energy island. And the reason I'm very excited about it, and it's being pioneered, first of all, in Denmark, by Denmark in the North Sea. But the idea is that you can connect offshore wind farms onto an island, and that island then connects into the main grid. But the reason it's great is because on that island you can also put hydrogen production, electrolyzers. You can put battery storage, and probably a range of other technologies potentially that would help us to manage the energy that's pumped into the grid, and help to deal with issues like intermittency of wind, and those types of issues, which we know are going to be a problem once we transition into essentially in the long term 100% zero carbon electricity system, which, by the way, has to expand in order to decarbonize transport and heat as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll leave it there, but very excited to be on this panel and to kind of engage with the panelists and the wider audience about these issues, which are critical, very difficult, and will need a lot of coordination to kind of make headway.
Alan, thank you very much. You're really painting a challenging scenario there, but boy, some of the figures, the numbers you've quoted are just incredible. So it'd be interesting to explore how we get into delivery of those. I'm going to come to Ian next, just to finish off the panelists, and then I'd like to bring in Jerome Mayhew, if I can, after Ian's just done his little introduction. I hope that's okay. Ian, over to you.
That's fine, although I'm happy for Jerome to ask his question now, if that helps.
Jerome, have you time to wait, or?
So it's not really a question. I've got something to say. So I'll wait for Ian, and then if I can butt in after that, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ian, over to you.
Well, thank you, everyone. So I'll just say a bit about BP, and then talk a little bit about what our activities are in the UK. You may notice this morning that our results have come out, and in that we've actually upgraded our commitments around net zero and our ambition to get there quicker. So BP is a leading global energy company, and we provide heat, light and mobility solutions for customers all over the world. Our purpose is to reimagine energy for people and planet. And in 2020, we set an ambition to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and help the world to get to net zero. So we welcome the importance placed on the transition to net zero and the urgent need for new large-scale infrastructure. That includes areas where we're investing significantly, such as offshore wind, carbon capture, utilisation and storage, hydrogen and electric vehicle charging. So bringing together some of the points from Ashaya and Alan. On the topics discussed today, our view is that more integration is needed. Greater generating capacity from offshore wind will be needed far beyond the 2030 target of 40 gigawatts in order to support production of green hydrogen, but not to forget that blue hydrogen is critical to decarbonising heavy industry. So green hydrogen produced from renewables, blue hydrogen from essentially decarbonising natural gas and using carbon capture and storage. Most energy projects that are being commissioned today are being done so on a standalone basis. But because of the complexity of net zero, we do need consideration on how to encourage integrated projects in the future. So thinking about hydrogen, we're leading the development of the net zero Teesside hydrogen cluster of industrial, power and hydrogen businesses linked to the Northern Endurance Partnership's East Coast cluster. So the business we're developing is H2 Teesside, and that's aiming to produce 1 gigawatt of CCUS-enabled blue hydrogen starting up in 2027. The aim is to capture and store up to 2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, and that's equivalent to the heating emissions of 1 million UK households. The first phase of the project is aiming to meet roughly 20% of the low carbon production proposed in the government's 10-point plan for net zero. In addition to that, we're developing the High Green project also on Teesside, producing green hydrogen for transportation and industrial uses, and we're partnering with the City of Aberdeen to develop their hydrogen hub. And this week we were recently confirmed as the JV partner for that project. Moving to offshore wind, we partner with the German utility company EnBW, and together we've been successful in our bids in round 4 and more recently in ScotWind. So together we're the preferred bidders for just under 6 gigawatts of capacity, and that's equivalent to powering over 6 million UK households with clean electricity. And that clearly is contributing to the UK government's 40 gigawatts by 2030 target. We do agree with a more strategic and simplified approach to planning and development of offshore wind, and the supergrids or energy islands concepts are very attractive in many ways. We do have a slight caveat to that, though, which is we think that developers and industry should be able to co-create the holistic network design with the ESO. At the moment, it feels like it's being done a little bit in isolation, although that's been softening recently. As of today, round 4 projects in particular are already facing a delay of 6 to 12 months waiting for the outcome of the offshore transmission network review, and that is placing delivery of the 2030 ambition at some risk. In our view, there is a nuanced approach that's needed between east and west coast of the UK because the installed capacity and also the available space for onshore connections varies considerably between the different coasts of the UK. In some cases, developer-led coordination using the traditional off-tow model can deliver many of the benefits anticipated by OTNR, but quickly and more efficiently. And we really hope that that's the outcome for the Irish Sea in particular, although I do recognise the self-interest in saying that. There's an added dimension to this, which is around supply chain. So there's ever-increasing ambitions linked to the CFD process, in particular around local content and the ability to generate value for the UK. But the supply chain has finite capacity, and that will restrict concurrent delivery of multiple round 4 and ScotWind projects connecting in 2030. If we're able to smooth out the annual overall delivery of those projects and the associated demand, that should unlock greater supply chain certainty, lower risk, more sustainable jobs, and ultimately a benefit to the UK economy as a whole. If we're able to do early connection of as many projects as possible prior to 2030, that should in theory allow phasing of grid reinforcement works, reduce pressures around logistics and infrastructure in the offshore industry, and maximise the participation opportunity for UK supply chain. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks very much. I like the bit where you mentioned value for the UK. There were a couple of ifs in there, so let's see how we can change that into we will. Jerome, over to you now.
Thank you very much, and apologies everyone for being slightly taken by surprise at the start of this presentation. Right, so we're kicking off. The reason why we're talking about this so much is because of the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and notably amongst that, the ambition to get to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. This is brilliant because it's something we can all get around. It's easy to understand. It gives us clear direction of travel and focus. But from my perspective, it also is rather damaging because it gives us this false date by which time, just an arbitrary date, 2030, by which time we've got to have 40 gigawatts out there in the offshore to be defined as a success. And by having that arbitrary date, there is a risk that we are going to take shortcuts in order to achieve short-term aims at the expense of long-term costs and opportunity. And that comes down to the period for design and implementation of an offshore transmission network. Because as we've heard from a previous speaker, we set up with the CFD regime from 2010 onwards, essentially radial connections to the network. And that was excellent for the size of the industry as it then was. I think that's generally accepted. It got us a head start. But now we've got up to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind, and we're putting in 30 gigawatts nationally in the next 10 years. Radial connections are no longer accepted and acceptable. And that was reflected by Kwasi Kwarteng in the dispatch box in December 2020 in a response to a debate of mine, where he said, and this is basically a quote, the battle for an offshore transmission network has been won, and it's just a question of timing. And so we've got this rather uncomfortable position we're currently in, where we've got the what are they called, pathfinders projects, and then we've got early opportunities before we get to what's described as the enduring regime, which is apparently from 2030 onwards. The difficulty we've got there is that the National Grid ESO, when assessing the opportunities for an offshore transmission network, estimated that there would be £6 billion of capex and opex savings for the industry if that was adopted as quickly as possible by roughly 2025 onwards. And that saving would still be there, but it would be halved. So it'd only be £3 billion if we waited until 2030 before implementing a form of offshore transmission network. And so we've got this sort of clash between the project manager side of the offshore networks and the long-term benefit of the design and operation. So the project managers say, well, I've got all these in-flight projects, I just want to get them done, that's my job. And someone needs to have a chat, frankly, with the chief executive and say, look, you can save £6 billion by 2050 if you go faster. But the political imperative of having this 40 by 30 means that people are terrified of short-term delay, even if it gives us medium-term acceleration and gain, which an early adoption of an offshore transmission network would give us. And I'm concerned, frankly, about the costs of further delay for the OTN. So we've got, I think it's been touched on, but we've got genuine issues in the North Sea anyway of seabed clutter. The more radial connections you provide, the harder it is to develop a decent and effective offshore transmission network with interconnector and radial connectors, as in round radial connectors. We've got the hard cash costs, which I've already talked about. But then very importantly, and here I'm speaking as a Member of Parliament for Norfolk, where a lot of these connections are coming ashore, is you've got the very real prospect of a widespread loss of consent. At the moment, we've got general acceptance that offshore wind is inverted commas, a good thing. We've got lots of people saying, 40 by 30, or the underpinning message behind that, which is we want a very substantial increase of our renewable energy in the southern North Sea. People are signing up for that. But if you're in Corston or Alton or in Attlebridge in my constituency, and you've got four trenches being built actually crossing over each other in your village, and they're going to be building them for the next 10 years, then, and because the minister's already told you that there's a better alternative that's out there, but they're not bothering to wait to put in the better alternative, they're just going to carry on with radial connections. You're already seeing judicial review for this process, which was successful. So Ray Pearce and his judicial review last year was successful. You ain't seen nothing yet. There are a lot of very educated, very committed people who are increasingly saying this is irrational. The current continuation with radial connections is actually irrational to deliver a notional target for a notional date when the evidence suggests that if you go hell for leather for an OTNR designed, I take on board all the implied criticism that maybe the ESA are doing this by themselves too much and they need to involve the industry. I think that's fair comment. But we need to get on with it, because you're at real risk of losing consent of local communities, as well as increasing environmental and social damage by having multiple connectors. So bring that all together, what do we need? Well, we need anticipatory infrastructure. We need, frankly, and this may be a bit rude of me, but we need a change of attitude by Ofgem. I think up till now they've been more of the problem than the solution. We've had an energy white paper which took long enough. We desperately need an energy bill in the next session of Parliament, and I'm very hopeful that will be there. And we've got to, which will be politically very difficult from my side of things, but if an earlier adoption of the OTN means that we have a slowdown in delivery at in the next 2 or 3 years, with the benefit being that you have an increase and cheaper delivery in years 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 and 15, then yeah, politically that's embarrassing, but actually for the good of the country, that's absolutely the right thing to do, and that would be my job to help win that argument in Westminster.
Wow, well, there's a few challenges to you all. Thank you very much for that intervention. That was absolutely great. Ashir, sorry, Pet, you're going to start this conversation. What would you like to pick out of that little basket?
Thank you, Barbara. I thought you might come to me. So, I mean, I don't think the challenges that have been articulated, they are understood, and I think what I would say though is I think as an industry we are very cognizant of the sort of the engagement with the communities and the impact of all this infrastructure and the development that needs to come onshore. I don't think, certainly as National Grid, and I know lots of the wind developers are in the same place, I don't think there's that is not recognised. I think it's a difficult one because there's lots of strategic things that need to fall in place, like the holistic network design, like the outcome of the OTNR. We don't know what the outcome of the OTNR will say, and I think that is quite difficult. Then we've got some inkling, but it's quite difficult to sort of plan and work out what needs to come first and what needs to come after. Mm-hmm. So it may well be that I guess as an industry, our commitment to helping the UK to get to net zero is there. And I think that's a good thing and something I think you should take away from this panel discussion and many other discussions you've been involved with and with us as a community, as an industry. But I think it's also fair to say that, if all of these milestones don't line up and we can't have a sort of this top-down approach of what should the design be and then deliver that investable landscape, it'll be difficult for us to go out there and build new things, and that's how we then end up in what you call an uncoordinated world. Mm-hmm. So I think, just speaking from National Grid's perspective, I mean, this is why we are looking at Pathfinder projects and trying to bring sort of wind generators and our wires together. We don't have all the answers. If I'm sitting here today, I am involved in some of this, but we don't have an exact view of how this is going to work. This is all new stuff, and we're working with our counterparts on their energy islands, and they don't know exactly how it's going to work. Everything from the supply chain, the regulation, the markets, it's all new to everyone. And I think, the more help we can get in terms of governments coordinating, regulators coordinating, we'll be in a better place to be able to coordinate that build of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. I think the answer is we don't have all the answers. That is literally the answer. I think it would be very naive of me to be sitting here saying, we know what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. We just don't. I've had numerous discussions trying to work out what we call multipurpose interconnectors, wind, the onshore infrastructure, the offshore connections on the other side, how it's going to work. We're still working through all of this. Mm-hmm. But we do need clear sense of direction from the offshore transmission network review, holistic network design. Those things need to come together to give us a sense of direction of where we want to go. Mm-hmm. And I think the two needs to meet somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Well, I'm aware that Lord Deben has said that what he's looked at, the sort of whole approach at the moment is nonsensical. In my mind, I'm kind of wondering, do we need something like a citizens' assembly to draw all of these parties together, interested parties together, to do some sort of analysis? I don't know. Alon, where are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Barbara. So I just wanted to, there's a lot there, obviously. I want to say, I think that the case, Jerome, you made is actually really strong and coherent. And I think, you know, as you say, the case for kind of short-term delay in exchange for longer-term acceleration, and if we can save 6 billion or thereabouts, you know, that's got to be worth a significant effort to try and make it work.
Mm-hmm.
I was also really interested to see you kind of pointing out one of the challenges is getting the regulation in place and allowing anticipatory investment by Ofgem, which has been a kind of an issue in the policy debate corridors for a long time. I did a piece of work for the National Infrastructure Commission in 2019, where we did a report on the future of the regulated industries, so energy, water, and telecoms.
Yeah.
And one of the key points that we made there was the need for for Ofgem to allow under certain, you know, under controlled circumstances, anticipatory investment in the networks, both in terms of, you know, hydrogen, EV charging, and offshore wind connections to make them more coordinated. And now, I mean, I know that, and I wanted to turn this sort of into a question. I know that Ofgem have been obviously pretty occupied with the energy crisis and the cost of energy crisis and the whole sort of mess that is the retail market at the moment. But I was wondering, particularly maybe to Ashia, sorry, do you feel like you're getting enough engagement and I guess enough push from the regulator, really? Because what I mean, as Jerome was saying, what is needed is people to really be pushing for this to happen. Yeah. Absolutely right that there's a, you know, number of different coordination problems and it's all sort of new, and but somebody has to come up with some proposals that can then be, you know, kicked around through consultation or whatever, so that we can get things moving. So do you feel like you're getting enough kind of partnership, or that you are being pushed sufficiently by the regulator to help come up with these solutions, or is there a little bit of a vacuum at the moment?
So this is always a difficult question.
You're amongst friends, honestly. Just say it as you find it.
I think
we'll all be careful with what we say afterwards.
I think it's fair to say that through the review that Ofgem has recently carried out, they've come out with a new cap and floor window to look at the potential for multipurpose interconnectors. And I think that is a next step that focuses our minds on what we could potentially offer. I also think it's fair to say that between BEIS and Ofgem and the ESO, there's sort of, and I don't mean to pinpoint any one party, this sort of, you know, what everyone knows we need coordination, but that next level of exactly how we are going to coordinate, is anticipatory investment going to be, you know, super important, and the way to go? Are we going to make strategic investments? You know, that's sort of the principles that underpin what we are going to invest in order to get to net zero, for me, haven't been yet articulated. And I can't say whose job it is to do this, but I think somewhere between those three parties, we need to get that clarity. And I think once we have that clarity, it will become clear that, you know, whether we can, which pathway we're going to go down. You know, are we going to have radial connections like Jerome has just highlighted, or are we going to have a delay to the 2030 targets or whatever, you know? But getting that clarity on what network design will have, what investments are going to be needed, that is very, very important. And I think that will also help our supply chain, because I think it's fair to say that we're talking earlier, there was the comment about project managers just going for it. But it's also true that as an industry, we might not be quite geared up to deliver all of this at the moment because we've not signalled to all of our EMs that all of this needs to be delivered. So there is a danger there that even if we do coordinate, we coordinate too late and we don't end up with having the infrastructure in the pipeline to be able to deliver on time. So it needs to come together so that we can plan ahead, you know, and that needs to happen this year. And I think the delays that Ian outlined around sort of, you know, because of the OTNR, we can feel that as well, you know, we're waiting for it. So that's the sort of thing that we need to see, and all that next level of detail to give us the principles of where we need to go. So I'm not trying to circumvent your question. I think Ofgem has come out with some principles, but I think there's more that's needed, and I'm not quite sure where it sits. But it feels like those three bodies together need to deliver a clear, not just strategy, but plan of how we get there.
Yeah. Ian, would you like to come in on this question?
Yeah, I think Jerome makes his points really well, and I agree with all of those. There's some perverse incentives in the system at the moment that are possible to unpick. So what are the things driving developers, particularly kind of round 3 and round 4, hell for leather in somebody else's words, to get connected is the option fees in there, and this was particularly true for round 4. And at the point where you introduce the OTNR process, you've suddenly got a disconnect between the timeline we were all bidding on in round 4 and then when we think we're going to get connected. So there's the perverse incentives here. Clearly, the longer the duration between agreement for lease and then lease, the more money that flows to Crown Estate, the more money that flows into the public purse. But that in itself is the thing that damages the returns on the project and really challenges the financial viability. So there's 2 things in there that could take off that pressure and give a little bit more breathing space to actually take the time to implement an offshore transmission network. So one is to put a sort of pause on the option fees and realign it to the actual consenting pathway and connection pathway, not to reduce the amount of money expected to flow into the public purse, but just to pause it and phase it. The other one is to look at the CFD frequency. So at the moment, it's biannual rounds. The whispers we're getting out of Low Carbon Contracts Company and BEIS is that they're looking at moving to an annual cycle. At the moment, you've got the situation where even a month or two's delay on individual bits of the consenting and connection process could tip you 1 or 2 years later, depending on the timing of the CFD rounds, the weather for constructing offshore. There's a whole bunch of things that come together that challenge that. The anticipatory investment is a really interesting, but it's probably the bit I worry about most in the grander scheme of things, because it's all very well as being given ultimately grid connections, but what there's no guarantee on at the moment is whether the onshore grid itself will be sufficient and resilient enough to take that. So I think the critical bit here for me is making sure the anticipatory investment flows in on the back of whatever the holistic network design says, so that we've got the onshore in sync with the offshore as we start to then bring, you know, tens of gigawatts more connection in over the coming months and years.
Right, thank you. Jerome, I was going to go back to Alan and then a share. Is that okay, or would you like to come in here? Yeah, that's fine. Alan, over to you.
Right, I just wanted to make a really quick point, which is so Ian, in response to Ian's point, which I thought was really interesting about what's driving the breakneck pace of development and the very high fees paid for seabed leases in the round 4 auctions last year. Well, I mean, that's not inevitable. I've been working a lot on kind of auction design with the governments in the Netherlands and the UK and in the US. And in the US, they have auctions for seabed leases for offshore wind. They've had them for, you know, well over 8 years, but they don't pay them per year. They pay one lump sum upfront. So delays don't end up costing the developer any more.
Right.
And yes, I mean, I can see that, you know, there was clearly a rationale and a logic and a good reason for Crown Estate to kind of have this incentive on developers to develop your project as quickly and efficiently as possible. That's a good thing to have. But I think in this context, where a lot of the things are out of the developer's control, it can just can lead to, as Ian says, kind of perverse outcomes, and people developing the projects faster than the system really can cope with, and that's not good for anyone. So it's kind of part of a much wider conversation, but clearly, when Crown Estate are thinking about their next auction, one of the things they should consider is it really the right format and model that they have in place now, or would a more kind of lump sum auction format be better? So that was all I wanted to say, and yeah, please go back to Ashia.
Oh, that's really helpful, thank you. Ashia?
Yes, I just wanted to say, I think Ian made his points a lot more elegantly than I did in terms of the anticipatory investments. I think that is quite key, actually, because I think traditionally as a country, we've not gone down this road. And like, was highlighted earlier, a lot of it has been done really cost effectively on a sort of case by case basis. But I think because of the coordination that's now needed across onshore infrastructure, offshore wind, wires, and hydrogen and all kinds of things, wonderful things that all come together to deliver net zero, I think that there is almost a bit of a mindset change needed about thinking that anticipatory investment and more strategic investment might actually put us in a much better place and may well alleviate some of the issues we are facing along our coastal communities as well. And I also think, there's a lot to learn from the other countries that are coastal. So Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and others, we've got interconnectors with a lot of these nations as well. And for me, this is where the sort of the broader EU, UK coordination sort of comes in as well, because we're not talking about building 40 gigawatts and that wind should only be coming into the UK. We really should be thinking about, the ways in which that wind can be utilised and optimised and the use of it maximised across all these coastal communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Very good point. Jerome, back to you.
Thank you very much. It's so frustrating listening to all this, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we hear, oh well, we need to have coordination, we need to have design, and I've only been in politics 2 years. I was a businessman before that, and that's just telling you what's going on. And I've had conversations where it's totally clear when you're talking to Ofgem, National Grid, that no one feels they're responsible for the design, and even the coordination between offshore and onshore, there is no one putting their hand up saying, I am personally responsible, and this is how it's going to work. So if you're going to fix one thing, start at the top, fix that. Have one person, ideally, heading a single organization who is directly responsible for making this work. So somebody's head is on the block, and they know that it's not, oh, look, well, I had a meeting and I'm sure we were going to make a plan, and what happened? Okay, well, we have another meeting, which slightly feels like where we are at the moment. And, given that this is a highly political environment, it's got to be with BEIS, isn't it? So the Energy Minister, Greg Hands, and Kwasi Kwarteng, who's the Secretary of State, we're very lucky with the Secretary of State that he used to be the Energy Minister. He genuinely understands this area. He's really got under the bonnet on it. And we need to have, I'm repeating myself, I know, but we need to have the energy bill as soon as possible, absolutely as soon as possible, so we can sort out the regulatory drag that we've got with Ofgem. And then ideally give them direction, and I've raised this with ministers already, give them direction in advance of the bill, saying, look, the rules are changing in the next 6-9 months, but that's the direction of travel, get on with it now. And that's what we need, I'm afraid. And I'm all for international interconnectors, but there is a political risk associated with those, which was highlighted rather unhelpfully by the French in Guernsey a couple of months ago. And with the current, I know it's in gas, but the geopolitics of international reliance on other suppliers for your electricity, there is a real benefit in national energy security. And connectors are great for balancing, but we can't rely on that as a geopolitical thing.
Thank you. Points well made. Can I just sort of take us somewhere else for a little bit? Can I bring hydrogen into the discussion? So I just wonder what needs to be done to make the interplay between hydrogen production and offshore wind a reality. We've concentrated on, you know, wind farms and connections there, but we've got other products that we can be making and can bring onshore. What are we doing there? Would anyone like to take on that question, Shea?
So I actually raised my hand to respond back to Jerome.
No, do that first. Do that first.
If I may. Obviously, you know, I manage our interconnectors, so I think I take a very different view of this.
Quite well, go on.
I think, you know, it's been quite, you know, interconnectors have been key in terms of reducing the cost of energy in the UK, and also very key on security supply issues. You know, we've got lots of examples which I'd be very happy to share with you of days when, you know, the system was very tight in the UK and the power flew the other way. And I think the importance of that was recognised in the free trade agreement. I think there's a lot that happens on Twitter, but in reality, what's written in hard cold trade agreements actually means that, you know, the fact is interconnectors to the UK are treated in the same way as the ones within the EU, and that's quite clear in the free trade agreement. And so I don't really read Twitter that much, but you know, hopefully that shouldn't distract from what's in the hard legal document either. But on the hydrogen, and I'll let Ian talk through this because I'm sure he has a lot more to add to it, but there's a huge amount of work going on looking at energy islands where we've got hydrogen cohabiting with offshore wind and other technologies. And I think, you know, there's a lot of sense in terms of utilising existing infrastructure as well, and making sure that we can leverage on the infrastructure that's already there, and not necessarily rebuilding where we can avoid to do so. But I'll let Ian talk through this a little bit more.
Okay. Over to you, Ian.
Yeah, so we've got skin in all of these games, and the key thing that would help us at the moment is actually just clarity and certainty around establishing the business models. So we've got a pretty good handle on the technology, and also clearly the project management skills and the ability to deliver on these. It's just getting the fiscal regimes right underneath. So there's been some really good stuff from the government on this, with the progress on the progress on the hydrogen investment framework, which is helping us get clarity around, because there's some specific objectives in there for the mid-2020s around electrolytic and CCS enabled hydrogen, and you need both in order to deliver the net zero targets. If you're looking at the green hydrogen, we're going to need clearly huge volumes of gigawatts flowing from offshore wind in order to do it. The bit that's going to be slightly tricky to manage in that is the additionality rules. So making sure that that capacity that's flowing into that can be put also into supporting the hydrogen production as well as power for domestic use. So at the moment, we welcome the government's technology neutral stance on all of this, but it's just keeping a pragmatic and flexible approach to the additionality lets us actually get after the net zero targets through an integrated approach. What we wouldn't want is for either the electrolytic or the CCS enabled to be artificially handicapped because we haven't quite got the policies right. Because being able to unlock rapid growth in this is really important. So if we think about, so Alan talked about energy islands, and it is smoothing out the fluctuations in supply and variability. So you need things like electrolyzers as a balancer for the whole system. And if you've got those underpinned by long-term power purchase agreements with renewable assets, that gives you the basis for operating energy islands and using surplus wind generation to provide an energy buffer to then release back into the grid as dispatchable power. So it's making sure that the policy regime is lined up behind enabling rapid growth of that, I think, is where we get to.
Right.
Jerome's on mute at the moment if you're trying to chip in.
What I was actually saying was I was talking to my researchers saying I'd love to get your details so I can talk to you afterwards, because you're speaking a lot of sense, and I need to be educated. Whilst I've got the floor, I agree with everything that Ian was saying, and he's got lots more knowledge than I have. I've got just one sort of broader, if you look on national terms, blue hydrogen makes all sorts of sense. So CCS hydrogen. My personal view is that green hydrogen, i.e. electrolyzed offshore wind, essentially, it may have a role for balancing the grid, but its other role is going to be marginal as a major producer of hydrogen, particularly if we're ever thinking that we're going to have enough hydrogen floating around to put into the gas network for domestic boilers. I just don't understand that. I think hydrogen is always going to have a very key use in industry. We're always going to want to, we're never going to have enough hydrogen, basically. So to start thinking we're going to be boiling our kettles with hydrogen, I know lots of other people disagree, but my personal view is that we're never going to have that much, and that green will always be a niche product.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Alon, would you like to come in on that? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, great. So a lot of really important points there about hydrogen. I think my view is it will be not niche. I agree with Jerome that it's unlikely to be viable in kind of domestic boilers or that sort of thing. But I do think green hydrogen is going to have a significant role to play. And the reason I say that is because blue hydrogen requires CCS to happen as well, right? So CCS is a completely unproven technology at commercial scale, whereas we know how to produce hydrogen from electricity. It's the generation part of it is really much further along. So CCS, I'm sure, will happen, but I've been in government. I was in government when we tried to make CCS happen, 10 years ago. It didn't. So there's probably a reason for that. It's difficult. I agree with Ian. The government seems to be doing a lot of great stuff on the current business models for CCS and for hydrogen. And obviously, given my background in designing the CFD for electricity, I'm delighted that the policy framework, the policy instrument that they've decided is going to work this time is a CFD for hydrogen and a CFD for CCS. So I think that's great, but the devil really is in the detail. And a CFD for CCS for hydrogen is significantly different from the CFD that we designed for renewable electricity or even for nuclear electricity back in the day. So it seems to me that there's a lot of detail still needs to be kind of sorted out there. But essentially, in answer to your question, Barbara, what do they need to do to get hydrogen moving? I think the kind of wider point I would make, kind of as an economist, is they need to create a market for hydrogen. They need to create demand for it. And that's the same thing as Ian was saying, just kind of with more kind of specific detailed ideas about long-term power purchase agreements or, the CFDs, etc. But there's no market currently for hydrogen. There is a market for electricity. It is well established. It needs all kinds of continued reform, but at least it's there. There's a market price for electricity. There isn't really a market price for hydrogen. And I think the government needs to help set that up. In fairness, that is what it's trying to do with the business models and the CFD, etc. It's a long-term contract for hydrogen offtake, but there's still a number of challenging issues to get through because there just isn't a market yet.
Mm-hmm. Ian, I see you'd like to come back in on that.
Yeah, it's to both agree and respectfully disagree with Alan. I think the problem's not the technology. So we were involved it was the Peterhead project all those years ago. Its business model. That business model was the linked to that. It wasn't the technology. The industry's been storing carbon dioxide in reservoirs for decades now, and we know how to do that. So it's simply, can you establish a viable business model? So that's where the 2 hydrogen clusters that are being piloted by the government are so important. So we're leading on the net zero Teesside cluster, which links together power generation, carbon capture and storage, decarbonisation of heavy industry, and actually proving and developing the business models around that. There's the net zero Humber, zero carbon Humber below it, which again ties into the same reservoir. There's HyNet over on the west coast, just around Stanlow and sort of Port Sunlight, that sort of area. So that's moving in a positive direction, and I think it is just a case of getting the right regime around it to make those business models work. Things that may link into that, carbon pricing. So we've called for carbon pricing for many years now, and that's really important because that starts to shift the economics and make things like CCUS viable. And if you want heavy industry in your country, and we certainly do because we think it's an important part of the UK economy, then you need to decarbonise, and hydrogen is the way to do that, and specifically blue hydrogen for the majority of those heavy industry cases.
Excellent, thank you. Jerome, I see you'd like to come back in there.
Thank you, and this will be my last intervention because I've got to go, I'm afraid. But you're absolutely right. Underlying every business model, the reason why we have to generate and sort of make up business models is because there's no price for carbon. If we had a price for carbon, then we would unlock the power of the free market to find myriad different consumer decisions, and as a result of that, the messages coming from the consumer would encourage the development of lower carbon technologies such as hydrogen. And we have a kind of a price for carbon at the moment. We've got a carbon price floor, and we've got the UK ETS, but because of the risk of carbon leakage, which is, if you, I'm sure lots of people on this call know what that is, but if you raise the price of your carbon domestically, essentially that's the price of energy going up, then manufacturers are incentivized to go abroad, or if they don't, we just suck in high carbon, low cost alternatives via way of imports. So what we actually need as a precursor to install a carbon price at a rate that affects consumer behavior is we need a carbon border adjustment mechanism at our borders. And the Environmental Audit Select Committee is undertaking an investigation on CBAM at the moment. It's something I've been pushing for the last 2 years. But until you can address the risk of carbon leakage, then you're prevented, essentially, in the world economy from having a significant price for carbon. And as a free marketeer, that's what we need, because I want fair exchange, and we know that there's a cost of carbon that's disappearing into the atmosphere. It's called an externality as economists, and to internalize that externality, bring the price of carbon back into all the other cost of manufacturing, ingredients, overheads, lighting, transport, profit, marketing, and the cost of carbon. Free marketers should welcome that. They typically don't, because they want to get away with what we've been up to for the last 100, 200 years. But that's what we need for free exchange. And then, as free marketeers, I believe that the incredible power of the market to find the right way will then provide the business case for hydrogen and many other things. So we are truly agnostic as to technology. Let the market decide. And on that note, I'm so sorry I'm having to leave early, and apologies earlier for not being prepared with a speech at the beginning, but I hope I've contributed.
Jerome, thank you ever so much. That's been really valuable. Thank you for your time. Thank you. Bye. Alon, what's your response to that then? We need a carbon price. How are we going to?
So I strongly agree with both Ian and Jerome that we need a stronger carbon price. It is the case we have one, as Jerome said as well. When I was working in government, one of the areas I was in charge of was helping to introduce the carbon price floor, so strengthening the UK carbon price, which clearly has a very big impact on the sectors that it actually affects, because the carbon price in the UK only applies to certain sectors, essentially the kind of electricity and heavy industry sectors. So there's absolutely no disagreement there. Although I would say I'm not as convinced that the only thing we need is a carbon price, right? And I've been here, I've been in the industry long enough. I know we've tried this a number of times. The nuclear industry in the 2000s and 2010s originally said, all we need to build a new nuclear power station is a decent carbon price. And the government strengthened the carbon price, and it still wasn't enough. So the government had to give them a contract for difference, a long-term offtake contract, so guaranteed demand, essentially. So they had to help create the market for the product, the electricity that they produce, in order to get the investment from the private sector into Hinkley Point C, which is now being built. And I think a lot of big infrastructure investors will feel the same way, that a carbon price is not reliable enough to mobilize many billions of pounds, which is what these projects take, and therefore something that gives them a little bit more certainty, like a contract for difference or a long-term power purchase agreement, is necessary to raise that finance at a reasonable cost.
Mm-hmm.
That may change. I mean, hopefully. Ultimately, it's about the strength and the reliability of the carbon price signal. So, if we get to a point where it is strong and reliable enough, then that will change. But at the moment, that's what I've certainly the experience that I've had from talking to investors in these big projects.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see by the clock we're coming into our last 15 minutes of this session. I wondered if there were any questions from the floor. I think you can pop them into the chat. We won't be able to take lots, but there's space for a couple in there, I'm sure. We've heard a lot so far about the different strands to this whole business of ensuring that we can get the wind projects delivered, the power back to land, distributed, etc. We haven't talked a lot about planning. We haven't talked about a lot about or said what solutions could be for the actual regulatory framework that can pull all of these strands together. Do any of the panelists have any views on that they'd like to share? So
I think on planning and consents, I think there's a general consensus that we basically need to have, that some reform is needed in order to move us to a space where there's greater drive towards coordination in developing the infrastructure. And I think, so Barbara, I've been in this industry long enough now to have been for a few market reforms and regulatory reforms.
Yeah.
And I've kind of got to this stage where I've become a little skeptical about them. And I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier around things need to be done in a structured way. So market reform can do two things. It can either encourage people to invest more, or it can actually discourage investment potentially because of the uncertainties associated with them. And I think we want to be in the former camp, don't we? But in order to do that, what we can't have is market reform going at it now based on the sort of the based on the design of the network as it is today, because we all know that design is not going to be there in 20 years from now. We don't want, for example, and I know this has been thought through in many quarters, locational marginal pricing on today's network, and then find out in 20 years from now, actually that corridor was absolutely fine. It's that corridor that's got lots of power now, And the interesting thing is, I was listening to people earlier talking about sort of technologies and what works and what doesn't work. I remember people saying solar would never work in the UK, and look where we are now. So, I mean, let's face it, we don't know everything. And I think what we need to do if we want to do market reform, and I'm not saying it's not required, it probably is in many areas, we need to have a network design that we know is going to be there in 20 years, and that needs to be thought through properly before we embark into market reform.
Yeah. Alon, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I actually don't have anything to add to that. I think there are big risks with kind of market design or market reform without thinking through the kind of holistic system, and the grid is absolutely, you know, essential part of thinking through how the market will work. So I don't have anything to add. I agree.
Yeah, it's a whole systems approach is required.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, it's big. Okay, I have a question about, what have I got? I've done hydrogen, I've done timetable for priorities.
There's a couple
sorry.
of questions, Barbara, on the chat.
Oh, are they? Right, I can't see those.
Yeah, so I think Jack is asking about where the engineers are going to come from. I think
education, perfect. Yeah, anybody got any views on that? I mean, we're opening up such an exciting potential future, but if we don't get the young uns in early enough, where on earth are we going to end up? Anybody got any views on those, Ian?
So I'll put a quick answer in the chat. So in a recent role, I've also been non-exec director of the National STEM Learning Centre, so the largest teacher training organisation for STEM subjects in the UK. There's a lot of nonsense thought about and talked about this, actually. So the phrase that quite often comes up is kind of 21st century skills or green skills. Actually, there's fundamental skills here. It's about interpersonal skills, essential skills around sort of teamwork, problem solving, communication skills. And then there's the technical aspects, which are based squarely on those traditional disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and maths. What changes all the time is the context in which those jobs are created. So I think there's two aspects to this, and you hear the old phrase just transition, which is important. So it's helping people in existing heavy industries move into these lower carbon sectors. Mm-hmm. That's the same retraining, reskilling, redeployment challenge that's been going on for decades. And then there's the setting and communicating exciting new contexts for young people coming through schools and through the rest of the education system. The bit that's critical to all of this is actually the capacity and the capability of the teaching workforce. So we have great teachers and great schools across the UK. We need to help them understand that changing context so that they then can be the right intermediaries for inspiring and engaging young people and helping them make informed careers choices as they go through. So I think it's not a new challenge. It's a challenge we've had forever. We have a competitive economy. We have a world-leading education system in many ways. It needs to continue to evolve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And a lot of it is about enthusing children at a very young age as well, isn't it? I mean, I was at my daughter's school last Monday talking to year 2 about electricity, and I actually turned up with a sort of a section of our cable, and you know, I got like 100 questions, and it was amazing. And I think starting at a young age is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've just recorded something with Durham Energy Institute for the International Women in Science Day, and we're going to send that out to schools. We ran it last year as a Zoom meeting, and the questions, they were just incredible. If anyone in this audience has an opportunity to get involved, you know, in reaching out to the younger kids, they'll lap it up. They really will enjoy that. I've got a question here from Elizabeth Lunn, north of Tyne. What role can combined authorities and local government play in enabling us to reach net zero? I see, Ian, you've had an opportunity to respond to that in the chat. Have you got anything to add, or any of you others? Cool.
I think what Ian's outlined, championing and integrating, very, very important. And also, I think what's important is to maintain an open line of communication. And, you know, what we don't, I think we all recognise the sort of the impact on on communities of all the infrastructure bill, you know, that, as I said earlier, that's widely recognised. I think we just need to make sure that we keep that open line of communication and make sure that individual issues are then addressed. And, you know, some of them, like there's quite a lot I understand around traffic management and things of that. And I think also being very clear as to what we're trying to coordinate. And I think once we get that sort of the holistic network design and, you know, any sort of top-down strategy from government, Ofgem and others, I think it's communicating that appropriately so people know what it is that as an industry we're going to be doing well in advance. I think will be really key. And I think, you know, we've worked with lots of communities, like Blythe is a good example of that, where, you know, we've ended up creating you know, this great understanding, as well as those great opportunities around the creation of jobs and apprenticeships, which can really make a big difference to the local communities as well. So I think we need to make sure we put emphasis on the opportunities, you know, that we can create.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've got a question here from Alex Dismore, who joined a bit late, and I know we have covered a bit of this, but I just wondered, as we're coming to the end, just in summary, are there any points that you'd like to make about the progress towards the government's ambitions on UK content, i.e. 60% by 2030? Or have you got any summing up comments you'd like to make? We have a very brief time left. Ian, any comments?
So the first thing I'd say on local content is it's really important. I think the limitations on it actually will be supply chain capacity. And so providing those clear signals to UK-based manufacturers and suppliers to enable them to build the capacity in to be able to participate in the opportunity is really important. The Offshore Wind Industry Council is doing some really interesting work at the moment, unpicking actually how much local content can you feasibly get in the UK supply chain. I think 60% is a challenge. I think somewhere in the region of 50%, all things being equal, should be very achievable. We're thinking about it both at a UK level, a regional level, and a local level, because that kind of community benefit in the broadest sense is really important when you think about how do you consent, how do you get connections. So being able to match the opportunity to the kind of impact is really important, and it's something we're very focused on.
Yeah. Alon, any final remarks?
I agree with all of that. I think there's a balance and a trade-off in local content. You know, you want to, you know, there has to. I think the UK actually has succeeded relatively well in fostering a domestic industry and having, you know, really significant numbers of jobs in these emerging industries, which are the industries of the future. And it's done that, you know, without too heavy-handed regulation in terms of the way it's done it, which is a contrast to, say, how it's been done in France or even the US. But there is this trade-off between, you know, we don't necessarily want everything to be local content if that means that the quality is worse or the cost is higher, and that ultimately cost is borne by the consumers. So we don't want UK consumers to pay ridiculous energy prices in order to force them to, because we're forcing developers to use local firms. So there is a trade-off, and I think it needs to be kind of more kind of organic, just continuing along the lines that we've done so far. There is a success story there. More is needed, but let's be kind of use a kind of light touch to steer it in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Share any final comments?
I guess I'd like to end on a note of optimism. You know, I think it's fair to say there's a huge amount of commitment to invest from a lot of entities, and you know, in a world where there's global competition for funds, you know, the UK attracts more than its fair share of investment, and I think we just need to make sure that we build a strategy, a government and regulatory strategy that can help to deliver those ambitions. I think that's, you know, we could be sitting here today and wondering where the investment's going to come from, but that's not what we're doing. We're sitting here today wondering how we can coordinate to make sure that we can develop and invest sustainably. And that is a much better conversation to be having than wondering whether we're going to have any investments in our energy sector.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Right, I think that's been wonderful, but I'm totally biased because I love these people. There's a little note in the chat, if you have a look there. Ross has put a link to a feedback form, and as he mentioned earlier, Net for Net Zero is a series of events ENA are holding throughout the year to focus on the solutions being deployed to help net zero. The next event will be held in the spring and focus on how we're tackling the decarbonisation of heat in our homes, and invitations will be sent out shortly. As part of that feedback form, it's really important for us to understand if there are any topics that the audience would like us to focus on in future events. And you can get in touch with us at info@energynetworks.org, and I'm assuming that the email address is within that feedback form, so thank you. I really want to thank Jerome Mayhew MP, who has I know has gone, to Ross Easton and all of our panelists for participating today. And behind the scenes, I'd like to say thanks to Josh and Dan, who've worked hard to deliver our first Next for Net Zero discussion. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you to the panelists in our usual way. And everybody.
Thank you to Barbara. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara.
I've enjoyed it. Stay safe, everyone. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.